I want to ask you about is the attitude, I suppose, to anti-Semitism in this country, because after 7/7, this listener pointed out to me, contacted me and said, after 7/7, that horrendous attack back in 2005, radical Islam was something we feared. People in the, often peaceful people in the Muslim community, rushed to condemn Islamist attitudes. Now we're in a situation where, with everything that's going on with Syria, everything that's going on in the Middle East with Gaza and Israel, Hamas and Hezbollah and the terrorist state of Iran are all lauded and celebrated in our streets. I just wonder what you think has happened over the past 20 years.
Well, I think that within the British Muslim population, we've always had those attitudes. I think that's the truth of it. And also, if you look at levels of anti-Semitism historically in the UK, they tend to be relatively high within British Muslim communities compared to the general population, especially more segregated elements of the British Muslim population. And I think that if October 7, you refer to that as a horrendous attack, Peter. It was a horrendous terrorist attack.
Yes,
it was an Islamist terrorist attack, ultimately. And I think that's been a real weakness, in my view, of the pro-Palestine movement, to condemn that as an Islamist terrorist attack. And I think that it needs to be very clear that you can condemn that attack, you can be pro-Jewish, you can also be very deeply critical of the current Israeli government. Yeah. Indeed, there's a significant chunk of the Israeli population who are not very supportive of the current government.
Totally. I mean, Netanyahu has a load of opposition in that country as well.
Absolutely. So I think that where the real problem I have is that those nuances are not being effectively captured. People look at this as very black and white in very binary terms. And I think that's a real problem. I think that actually weakens the pro-Palestine movement and more generally the cause of Palestinian statehood.
Tell us how it weakens it, because it is so black and white, because they are simply saying things that often aren't true, using words like genocide, for example, when what's happening, what Israel's doing factually is not a genocide.
Well, I think that there's even an argument, and this is my personal perspective, Peter, at the end of the day, and I appreciate that we may well disagree on this, but there's definitely been Israeli government policies which have been responsible for the mass displacement of Palestinian populations.
Totally agree with that. That's undeniable.
Absolutely, and I think that there's definitely the expansion of illegal militarized settlements in the West Bank. There's even Israeli civil society organizations which have condemned the expansion of those illegal settlements in the West Bank. And I think that the messaging just needs to be tightened. I think that if you look at October 7, it should just be very easy to say this was a horrific Islamist terrorist attack. And but I think by overlooking that or being reluctant to say that, I think it does weaken the credibility of the pro-Palestine movement. It really does, because if you want that to be a truly inclusive, wide-reaching movement, then you have to be able to say the obvious. So I think that what also is a real problem is that when you looked at some of the pro-Palestine demonstrations, and by the way, I did disagree with the former Home Secretary Suella Braverman, who wanted to ban those demonstrations. I think freedom of expression and freedom of assembly is very important that they're protected. There's very clearly aggressively anti-Semitic elements within those protests, which in my view are underpoliced.
Because I want people to have freedom of expression. I want people to have freedom of speech. A load of people, especially on this programme as well. I mean, I think we fundamentally disagree on a number of things, Rakib, and that's fine, because on this programme we disagree without being disagreeable. And both Rakib and I have this amazing super ability, this incredible superhuman ability to have different opinions, yet not hate each other, think that each other is morally inferior in any way. I really respect Rakib. I think he's a great social commentator. That's why I keep inviting him on my programme. But
and the feelings are mutual.
Very kind. The fact is, Rakib, that we have these protests. A lot of people say ban the protests. They've made their point. I think they probably have made their point, but nonetheless, you know, freedom of expression is something that I really care about. But how do you root out that anti-Semitic element? How do you root out people praising Hamas, Hezbollah terrorists, for example, those who would say that what happened on the 7th of October was justified? It was obviously completely unjustified. There are people who are, even though I fundamentally disagree with them, they are well-intentioned. They want peace in the Middle East, whatever. They want a Palestinian state. That's all fine to a degree, but they to me have to be much less tolerant of intolerance.
No, and there needs to be some very serious conversations within the pro-Palestine movement in terms of cultivating, in my view, a level of support for Palestinian statehood across British society, which is also anti-Hamas. I think that you can hold an anti-Hamas and pro-Palestine position. It's not a very difficult position to strike, in my view. And I think there needs to be a very serious conversation about expressing support or sympathy with proscribed terrorist organisations. If you live in the UK and you're ultimately politically engaged in the UK, that has to also involve an appreciation of the laws in the UK as well. And the reality is that there are proscribed terrorist organisations. And I think public authorities, the relevant public authorities, they have to put the line in the sand. And ultimately, they have to combat what I'd consider to be levels of support for those terrorist organisations, expressions of support. And I think that at pro-Palestine demonstrations, I think there was, in my view, an extremist minority within those demonstrations who are guilty of displaying pro-terror paraphernalia and also very aggressive forms of anti-Semitic chanting. And I think that really needs to be rooted out. And
But how do we root it out? I mean, are we talking about arresting people? I mean, I just don't feel the Metropolitan Police have done their job in this regard.
No, absolutely. That's what I mean when I use the term under police.
Yeah.
That includes not arresting people who may well be guilty of a very clear criminal offence. There's no point having proscribed terrorist organisations and then when people openly express sympathy with those organisations and support, that you don't act upon that.
Yeah.
Then there's no point prescribing those organisations to begin with.
Well, exactly. And those are very, very good points, Rakib. Thank you very much. Thanks for your patience today as well. That's Dr. Rakib Ehsan, who is a social commentator.